Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Imagine an MOPC, the project to establish land use planning rules for the municipality of Pictou County. Let me first walk you through the agenda of the presentation for tonight. So I'll start off with a quick introduction of the project. Um, then we'll move on to give a 101 about what's planning in Nova Scotia, how does it work, why do we plan, and how do we plan. I will then move on to introduce you to the draft, to the highlights of the draft documents that are being proposed for the municipality, and also give you an overview of further opportunities to engage on this process. But first things first, who are we and who am I? Quick introduction. My name is Paul Datz, and I'm part of Upland Planning and Design. We're a firm based in Halifax that was hired by the municipality to create a land use planning framework and run the public engagement on this project. There are about a team of 6 of us that were active on this particular project. So what is Imagine Municipality of Pictou County? It's a project to develop a municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw for the municipality. Currently, there's no land use planning in effect in the municipality, with the exception of the wind energy bylaw and the subdivision bylaw. So the development of wind turbines is regulated and the subdivision of land. But other than that, there are no rules on what could be built or developed where that is completely unregulated right now. And in 2018, the provincial government introduced legislation that requires now every municipality in Nova Scotia to have planning rules, which is what brings us together here right now. But it's not only because the municipality is required to introduce land use planning, that there are also some reasons why it's actually a good idea to do so. The municipality is unplanned and has grown organically over, a very long time, and it has worked so far pretty well for the municipality. However, we're in a time of a lot of changes, economic, demographic, and there's also right now a population increase. Over the last 4 years, the municipality has actually gained about 1,000 people, which is kind of a new trend. So it is a new situation in which there is growth. People are arriving. There's new investment happening in lands, and in such a context, to have no rules where pretty much anything goes and you can literally develop any sort of land use anywhere, any property. There are no checks and balances. It has the potential to create issues, right? Like I'm sure you can think of types of developments next door that you wouldn't like to have on a neighboring lot. And right now, if something undesirable gets developed, there's no recourse. There's nothing you can do against it. So this item is now being tackled through land use planning. So what is that actually? First of all, it's a collaborative process between you as citizens, business owners, civic leaders, and a joint process with the municipality to establish a common vision for for Pictou County. So it is something that's happening together in a collaborative process. It is at the end of the day, your document of the residents and your council who you are electing will pass this new bylaw and put it into effect that way. So it's really, in simple words, planning is most of the time about what is being built where. It's fundamentally about buildings and development and rules, what can be built where. And it is important to have some sort of idea how that happens because if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. Or more in the planning version of this is if you don't plan your community, someone else will. Someone else will maybe come out from the outside with an investment, have an idea to put a factory on a certain piece of land, and it may not be a fit for the community, right? There may be residences around it that are upset about this, and if there are no rules, then there's nothing that can be done against such things. So why do we plan? Well, I already mentioned a couple of reasons. Let's be a bit more specific. So planning helps to preserve and protect the character of communities and their identity. So on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of River John. So this is, for instance, a very historic village that has a very established identity in its core. So imagine if on this tightly knit street, somebody would put, for instance, a campground in the middle of it or an auto body shop. It would be disruptive to the character of the community. So it's the question is that is that a good land use for those kind of areas, right? But at the same time, in areas that are rural, where there's not a lot of density, these land uses are most likely perfectly fine, right? So it's about what's currently there, what kind of culture and identity is in place, and what goes along with it. Planning also helps us to prepare for change. So as you all know, frequent storm weather events are getting more frequent. It's more often that you see washouts through storms. Coastal erosion is also accelerating. So yeah, this is all related to climate change, and we need to think about, do we want to still build very close to the coast, for instance? Planning is also about protecting sensitive habitats, wetlands, for instance, which do a good job of not only increasing our biodiversity, but also protecting us from flooding to some extent. Dunes, right, by the coastline, like those are environments that are very valuable to protect our properties and assets. So it's important to protect those those habitats as well. But then there is also the need to actually set aside some land for industries. So forestry and agriculture are very long-standing traditional branches of the economy in Pictou County. And it is therefore also important to set aside some land so these economies can grow and prosper. And that's also something that planning can do. Traditionally, where the profession of land use planning is coming from is from the time of the Industrial Revolution, when the first big factories started showing up. And as on the image on the left-hand side, it was often the case that housing for workers was built right next door to those. Well, we have come to learn with time that this is not necessarily a desirable place to live right next to smokestacks. And that's kind of how planning started, pulling apart land uses and separating those that are not compatible. Another example for that is not everyone would like to live right next to a large livestock operation, as you see on the right. However, it is also important at the same time to make sure that what goes together can stay together. So small scale agriculture, hobby gardens, those kind of things. Planning can also make a contribution to make sure that these can be widely developed on any properties. So we don't need to separate out everything. Most things in a rural area work actually together very well. And that's also the job of planning, to identify what is compatible with each other and can work together on neighboring or the same properties. Planning is also important to manage or to help managing municipal infrastructure. Municipal in areas that are serviced by municipal water and sewer, those are some of the big ticket items in municipal budget. It is very expensive to operate municipal water and sewer networks, also other infrastructure such as sidewalks, are, kind of big items in the municipal budget. So it is important as a municipality and as you as taxpayers to have a say on where this infrastructure should be installed. And also, since it takes a lot of money to maintain that infrastructure, what specifically happens in those areas? How is that land used where all these assets are in the ground? Is the municipality, uh, getting a good usage of these lands where all of this investment has happened? So as a general rule of thumb, you can expect, and it's a good practice to have a higher level of stringency, have more planning rules in areas that have municipal services in the ground than in the general countryside, where this is a less important aspect of planning. So how do we plan in Nova Scotia? How does this even work legally? Well, you can think of planning in Nova Scotia as something that resembles building a house, and it's there are three layers here that are involved. First of all, there's the Municipal Government Act. That's the primary legislation in Nova Scotia that defines what municipalities can and can't do. So you can think of that as sort of the toolbox. It's the tools that the province gives the municipality to regulate land use planning. A level below that is the municipal planning strategy that defines the broad goals of municipal policies of land uses. And you can think of a municipal planning strategy as a blueprint to build a house. Or as a general vision of taking the example of River John, how do we envision residential development to look like in River John in 20 years? That could be, for instance, a policy. And then, so once you take the tools out of the toolbox, you have a plan to build a house, you actually, start putting the house together, building it, and that's kind of how you can imagine the land use bylaw to fit into these three levels. The land use bylaw is where the work actually happens. It's where the regulations are written down. How tall can a building be? How close can it be built to a street? What kind of other requirements are there in terms of shape and size of the building and so on. So this is very specific, and most people that ever deal with land use planning will mostly do it possibly just once in their life when they're building a house. And at that time, most of them would also deal primarily with the land use bylaw. Now, the land use bylaw has to agree with the policies of the municipal planning strategy above it, and the municipal planning strategy has to comply with the provincial legislation of the Municipal Government Act. So, and in this Municipal Government Act, there are some statements of provincial interest, which require that areas around municipal water wells are protected, that there is some level of protection for agriculture, floodplains, that you can't build, or just that there are restrictions about building in floodplains, that the plan allows to develop a variety of different housing types, and that enough housing is available, and that municipal infrastructure in general is used in an efficient way. So these are the things the municipality doesn't tell, that the province doesn't necessarily tell the municipality how these need to be implemented, not in detail, but they need to be considered. And also, this is what's new since 2018, 2019, the minimum planning requirements. What used to be possible was that in Pictou County, there was a land use bylaw that only dealt with wind turbines. So that, the only rule was if somebody wants to develop a wind turbine on a certain piece of land, that there are rules regarding setbacks, height of the turbines, and those kind of things. So that's a so-called single issue land use bylaw. Since the minimum planning requirements came out, the province says that's not That's not permitted anymore. If you have a land use bylaw, you need to also have cover other aspects and think about the economy of the area, about transportation, land uses, and so on, and have a comprehensive land use bylaw and planning strategy that covers all aspects of planning. But just going back to this toolbox comparison, it is really helpful to quickly review what kind of tools are in this box and what can the municipality do under land use planning, because then on the next slide, we also have a look what's outside of the scope. So a municipality can look at lot standards, how big are lots, where does a building need to go on a property, how tall can it be, regulations with regard to signage, what kind of processes are required to get a permit, can you have outdoor storage on a property, are there any parking requirements, landscaping. Those are the kind of things that the municipality is allowed to regulate. Those are tools given to the disposal of the municipality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to apply all of these things. You only need to apply and comply with the statements of provincial interest and minimum planning requirements. But those things, yeah, don't have to be all covered. There are, however, items that are just completely outside of jurisdiction of land use planning, and that's important to highlight here. So, for instance, resource activities, anything that's in the ground, any mining activities, are generally outside of the scope of this legislation. This is if somebody wants to mine a certain metal or anything else in the ground, they have to go through a provincial procedure and get permits for that directly from the province. Similarly, anything that's happening below the ordinary high water mark, so simply speaking in water, whether it's rivers, lakes, or in the ocean, the municipality has no say on that. It also goes through other layers of government. Planning doesn't affect people, what people do, how people move around. That's not part of legislation of planning. It also doesn't affect motor vehicles or anything to do with highways like speed limits or potholes or any of these items. That's not what we're talking about today. We're mostly looking at what's being built where, what kind of land uses happen on private properties. What's important to say, first of all, is anything that has been legally built and is legally in operation, whether it's houses or businesses, whatever is already in place can stay. So municipal land use planning never affects existing land uses. It's always a plan for what's permitted in the future. If you want to do something new with your piece of land, you will need a permit for that, and the zoning will define what can go on a property and what can't. But everything that's in place is, is considered legal non-conforming, meaning is allowed to stay in place as long as it continues and is still in use. It's a little different if a property gets abandoned for a long time, but as long as it's continuous operations, it's all fine. I'd also like to highlight that planning documents are dynamic. So they're not set in stone. Council has the powers to always go through a public engagement process and completely change the municipal planning strategy. And it's actually quite common that once the first land use bylaw of a certain type gets adopted, after a couple of years, there are so-called housekeeping amendments. The municipality looks at what's working, what's not working, where do we need to change the rules. And those changes are done. And land use bylaws should be reviewed periodically to make sure that changes are made as they are needed. So just because a certain rule is put in place right now, it doesn't mean it has to stay forever. Your municipal council has the power to change these things. So let's look quickly at how this process unfolded. So imagine MOPC started in the summer of last year. Shortly after the project launch and some background research, we started with the first phase of engagement in the fall of 2023. So that was very similar in character to what we're doing right now. We went out to the communities, had these open houses. We also had an online presentation like this one. And there was also a survey, mapping activities. And back then, we just reached out and wanted to know how do people feel about planning, what's important to them, and yeah, what kind of land uses would they like to see in certain zones and which ones wouldn't they like to see. Based on that feedback, we created the first draft of the documents, and we're presenting that draft right now. So once more, we're going to the communities, we're doing all this engagement, and based on that feedback, you will tell us now whether we got it right or wrong with this first approach to planning in the municipality. And based on the feedback, we'll do final changes, talk through with your counselors once more, and next year the documents will then presumably go to council and be finally adopted as the new bylaw for the municipality. So without further ado, this is what the new documents look like. The first draft, you can see the planning strategy on the left and land use bylaw on the right. And the municipal planning strategy covers 5 main topics, and these topics reflect the subjects that we heard the most about last year during the public engagement. So these are housing, agriculture, environment, recreation, tourism and transportation, and economic development. So once I introduce you to the zones, we will go also briefly through each of these subjects, and I'll show you how these have been reflected in the first draft of the documents. So this is the first set of zones that are being introduced in this draft land use bylaw. You may have had a quick moment to look at them. So I'll just briefly introduce them. It will be easier to do this on the map, so I'll just go very quickly through what's on here. So we have the rural general zone, which basically covers everything that would be considered the general countryside. The P2 zone is a specific zone that would cover land uses that can be considered the most kind of problematic one that you wouldn't necessarily want to have next door, like golf courses, campgrounds, those kind of, uh, land uses that cater to large crowds of commercial operations. Community core reflects zoning in serviced areas. Those are communities such as River John, Thorburn, parts of Alma, where municipal services are in the ground. Those are your typical traditional village cores where land uses are a bit closer together. Residential communities, that's a zoning where you also have municipal sewer in the ground, but where areas are predominantly residential and residents wouldn't like to see any type of commercial development in close proximity. Then there are some more general commercial zones that are applied to in the countryside. And of course, there is a special zone for larger industrial operations, specific zoning for parks and open spaces, specific zoning for areas that are subject to flooding. And one zone that's important to point out is the shoreline zone. So that's the only zone where even residential development is somewhat, is more restricted than anywhere else. In the shoreline zone, those are small subdivisions that are being, that exist on private roads where maybe the ownership of these roads isn't fully clear. So here we went in with a bit stricter standard to make sure that development doesn't grow too quickly in those kind of areas where the access through private roads may not be fully clarified. So this is what it looks like on the first ever zoning map being proposed for the municipality. So you can see most of the area here shows up in like the wider beige color, and that is the rural general zone. It covers the vast majority of the municipality. and it permits really anything that you would normally consider to, be present in such areas. So there are all sorts of, yeah, agricultural, forestry activities that normally happen in those areas, and a wide mix of land uses that you'll normally find there, except for those that I mentioned, for instance, yeah, campgrounds, but also things like racetracks, shooting ranges, those would be specifically regulated. And then also larger industrial developments. Those, for instance, fall in that purple zone that you see in the area of Abercrombie, where the tire plant is, and some other areas of the municipality. Then another zone that's fairly prominent is kind of the dark yellow zone that covers serviced areas. You see it around Plymouth, River John, Thorburn, and so on. So that's the community core zone that regulates the areas that are where land uses are a little bit closer because of the municipal services present. And then areas like Lynacy or Eureka, you have the residential center zone, where we're trying to keep things more residential. Shoreline zone on these little private road subdivisions along the coastline and around lakes tries to keep the intensity of development in these areas in check. So I mentioned those 5 pillars, 5 main subjects that we heard about in the original engagement last year. And so the number one topic that was talked about the most and that we heard about the most was housing. So that there are various challenges for younger people to enter into the housing market, but also for seniors that it's difficult, that are looking to downsize. So, well, introducing a land use bylaw, let's be honest, doesn't have a lot of potential to promote housing options in any way because it's a set of rules. But what we can do through introducing a new land use bylaw, it's to make sure that these newly introduced rules doesn't prevent anything good from happening. So we took care, and yeah, we're very watchful that there is lots of provisions to develop various forms of housing in the vast majority of zones. So for instance, in serviced areas, we generally permit 8 units per lot. And it doesn't matter if these are all 8 residential units in one building, or if it's 8 single detached homes on the property. Either way, that is eligible for straight up permits. In the general countryside without services, that number is 4 units. 4 units per lot in the rural general zone are also permitted on any property. And then the one zone that I mentioned that's a little bit more restrictive is the shoreline zone. You can only have a single unit building or a duplex or a one-in-one, like one home and a garden suite, for instance. If somebody would like to develop an apartment building that is more than 8 units, that's also entirely possible, but there is a requirement for a development agreement to be entered in with the municipality to regulate things like, is there enough service available in the water line, for instance, nearby, in order to run a larger building like that. Of course, any type of supportive housing options are also widely permitted in the land use bylaw. Agriculture, we heard a lot of feedback on that. There were kind of two sides to the story here. On the one hand, it's important for many farmers to have some sort of protection for agricultural land. So, because some farmers complain that agricultural land is disappearing too quickly. But at the same time, we heard loud and clear that it's super important to many farmers to, run their main do on their lands whatever they feel is right for them. If they want to create subdivisions, create residential development in order to, help them financially through a difficult time, that's also something that needs to be permitted in the county. So essentially, we didn't we didn't put any specific rules that would restrict agricultural land in any way that would be different from the rural general zone, except for one thing, in order to satisfy that earlier mentioned provincial statement of interests and a minimum requirement from the province, which is to prevent topsoil from being removed. So here is a map of the agriculturally valuable soils in the municipality. So the one and only rule that this land use bylaw is introducing, that topsoil can't be removed from the area, for instance, to be sold anywhere in the area that are marked in brown on this map. Of course, if you're developing a building and you need to dig a foundation for that, then some of that soil could be removed from the property, but it can't be removed as the primary land use on the property. There are some restrictions on livestock operations. There are some larger setbacks from property line and water courses and wells when new livestock operations are introduced in the rural general zone. But hobby livestock farms, so having buildings of up to 70 square meters, so yeah, or accessory buildings of over 20 square meters. So yeah, below those thresholds, it's possible to run a hobby farm, and the municipality is also not regulating how many animals are there. It's only about permits to develop these buildings. Of course, if there are existing buildings, as previously mentioned, they're just generally permitted. A lot of residents in the municipality of Pictou County are concerned about the environment, protection of nature, beaches is important. Lots of residents are worried about coastal erosion and flooding. So therefore, there are some buffers being introduced into this land use bylaw from any inland water courses. At least 15.24 meters need to be held in distance before developing new buildings. And from the coastline, we take a 30-meter setback from the top of the marine bank. There are some exceptions to this rule, but generally this is in place in order to both protect these sensitive environments and protect property owners from the effects of coastal erosion and collapse of a coastline, or from flooding from water courses. Wind turbines, as I mentioned, there is already an existing land use bylaw in place regulating wind turbines, so nothing is changing about that. And solar collectors, if EV, electrical vehicle chargers, are of course wide permitted, and yeah, won't have any burdens to be added to properties. Now for floodplains, we have some data from both from the province and from the federal government, actually, specifically on the East River and River John. And the approach we're taking there is based on the data we have received. So the data is classified in areas that flood once every 20 years and one every 100 years. So the areas that flood once every 20 years, those will be handled quite restrictive in the land use bylaw. Most forms of development are prohibited in those areas, and filling these areas with fill from outside the zone is not permitted. In the floodway fringe, it's more flexible. So if an area only gets flooded once in 100 years on average, there is just a requirement for these developments to be flood-proofed. So windows and doors have to be above the projected level of flooding. And also high-risk developments like hospitals, nursing homes, and warehousing, industrial uses where there would be a higher chance of toxins and chemicals be released during a flood event. Those are also prohibited there, but otherwise, most land uses are generally permitted in that floodway fringe overlay. And of course, there needs to be some level of protection for municipal wellheads, municipal source water. So in those areas, higher risk development also need discretionary approval um, by council. Another area we heard a lot about is recreation, tourism, and transportation. So in those areas, mostly these comments are reflected through policy in the municipal planning strategy that creates policy support for a new active transportation plan for both the towns and the municipality, requiring sidewalks on new public roads within serviced areas of the municipality where water and sewer are in place, where it's a little denser. New roads should also have sidewalks. These areas also contain a policy to prohibit new private roads in those areas and to have minimum standards for private roads in general. Trails and parks are, of course, permitted in the vast majority of zones. Accommodations in order to promote tourism are permitted in most zones. And yeah, those land uses that could be more conflicting with neighbors, such as shooting ranges, racetracks, campgrounds, these are also permitted. I mean, it's also possible to develop those, but there is a special step. You need to put in a planning application, and council will have a say on that, whether such a development can go forward in a particular location. Finally, there was quite a bit of talk about economic development, how it's important to have a diverse economy and job opportunities for everyone in the municipality. So yeah, the municipal plan documents do not and cannot really regulate some of the resource activities. So yeah, fishing, forestry, farming, agriculture is largely permitted everywhere. We even took care of small details such as that little vending stalls on the road are exempt from permit requirements. So made sure that, all these traditionally happening things in the municipality can continue. We also made sure that old institutional buildings, for instance, old schools that are decommissioned, that there is a lot of flexibility in the land use bylaw to make sure that those can be repurposed. So there are a lot of elements to keep the economy going. And that really covers the introduction of the new documents. Let me know if you have any questions. Other than that, just run quickly through the next steps, what will happen. So we're running these community meetings, these online meetings, and we'll also reach out to neighboring municipalities in the province if they have any comments on the current draft of the land use bylaw. Other than that, on the website through which you have access this meeting, all the documents are online. You can have a look and study the municipal planning strategy, land use bylaw. There's also information about a couple of in-person events that will still be happening. So have a look at the dates on the website. So once we conclude before the holidays, this round of public engagement, we'll summarize everything, and then in the new year, we'll be going through the feedback with council, see what's important to change, if anything in the documents needs to be tweaked, or if there are any bigger changes that we still need to consider. And then once we feel that everyone feels good about the new documents, we will then move forward with the formal adoption process through council. Once council adopts it, the province will review the documents, make sure they're compliant with provincial law, and then they will eventually come into effect. So yeah, here are the dates for the upcoming in-person meetings. If you want to attend any of those still, there is one on December 3rd in Union Center, December 9th in Plymouth, and December 12th in Scottsburn. Thank you very much. Here's once more the project website. And I'll leave it at that. Please, yeah, have a look at the website and please email us if there are any questions about this project or the contents of the land use bylaw whatsoever. And I will finish the recording now and open it up for discussion. Thank you.